Okay, hope everyone's good. Just gonna wait for people to join on. How are you all? Okay, let's go. Hi,
Hi,
Mrinal.
team.
How are you? Are you okay?
I'm good. How are you?
Yes, I'm not bad. I'm not bad at all. Okay, so let's let's get started then. So welcome everyone. My name's Dr. Tina Mistry, clinical psychologist, brand psychologist, and we have with us today somebody who has created an amazing piece of work for our community, something that I think that has been needed for a really, really long time. I'll introduce Mrinal, and Mrinal can talk a little bit about who she is, what she does, and yeah, the great piece of work that she has done. So I'll let you talk about that.
Okay, hi everyone. I am the author of Saya Unveiled, South Asian Mental Health Spotlighted. It was published this May 2021, and it is a collection of 11 true stories of South Asian second-generation immigrants living in the West who navigate mental health care. And the goal in my writing it is to increase education and acceptance surrounding mental health between generations in the South Asian diaspora. Each story is told in third person in kind of a journalistic meets creative writing style. I am a former news reporter and freelance writer myself, so this would be my first book, and it combines my interests with writing and journalism in addition to mental health and wellness.
Amazing. So for those people who want to find where Saya Unveiled is, where can they find it?
It is sold on Amazon.
Awesome. So Google, I say Google for everything. If you just put in the search bar Saya Unveiled, which is Saaya,
Yes.
Unveiled. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So I'm just gonna find my questions because I thought I had them, but they're not here. Let's get talking about the book. I mean, the book itself is, like you said, a collection of 11 stories. And when we first started talking, one of the things that we sort of reflected on was the themes around suicide. I mean, the first chapter itself addresses suicide. So for us, it was a really important conversation to have. And you know, we were toing and froing about sort of how do we contextualize this. And I think that, you know, the key thing is we're talking about suicide within the South Asian diaspora. So what we basically mean is for migrants who have moved over to the UK, US, Australia, wherever it is, that this is specifically around those specific, I'm saying specific a lot, those particular struggles around, you know, their mental health. So I wondered if we could start with just looking at kind of the research and the rates of kind of suicide and the demographics around that. I mean, my reading around it for the UK stats is that it's very patchy because in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the US, but we don't actually know somebody's ethnicity because it's not recorded on the death certificate. So to do any analysis would be really, really tricky. However, by doing kind of like, by running kind of analysis based on people's names, which is how I think they've got around some of the research studies, is how they've sort of found a increased or an elevated risk in South Asian women. Now, back in the day, back in the 80s and 90s, there was lots of research around, you know, South Asian cultural conflict is what they called it, of how many younger South Asian women struggled with their mental health and were presenting in mental health services for attempted suicides or self-harm. And this was something that, you know, was a bit of a concern for the services, and they started to do a bit of research into it. Now, we know that at this time, during this time, that there was a mass migration of people moving over from India and the kind of subcontinent to the UK. There was also high levels of racism. There was high levels of, you know, kind of difficulty in integration. So we call it acculturation stress. And also, one of the clear factors that the research found was that back in 20 odd years ago, and more than that now, that these people, these young women in particular, were displaying sort of this kind of cultural conflict, which is what I was talking about before, which caused them a lot of distress. So they had almost like Western values, but were forced to almost have these Eastern kind of restrictions, I guess, is what we're saying.
Yeah, so like the balancing of two cultures in a sense.
Absolutely, and that caused a lot of distress for a lot of these young people. Now, fast forward to 2022, we still don't know accurate numbers of how many people are of South Asian origin are dying by suicide. The most recent paper I found was by McKenzie in 2008, and what they found was that by using this kind of like fancy analysis, get my teeth back in, analyzing data on then by names, they found actually that it was South Asian older 65 plus older South Asian women that had an elevated risk of dying by suicide, and this was during the years of 1993 and 2003. So we're talking then, you know, that this is 20 years ago. So the research needs to happen. We need to understand, is this still the case? Are we still seeing, you know, elevated numbers of South Asian women who are struggling with mental health and ultimately being successful at suicide? Because we don't actually know the data. So I'm just wondering if you came across any sort of interesting statistics for the US.
For the U.S. itself, very few at all. I found like some statistics on the Asian suicide rate being high or somewhat high as a whole, but there were some other sources that kind of disputed that. So it's pretty patchy. I only know the ones from South Asia themselves, and I know that India has the absolute highest rate in all of South Asia.
Yeah. And that's something that we've kind of heard a lot about, you know, in terms of, it's been in the media, hasn't it, that India has got this really, really high elevated risk of suicide, and people are struggling there, which is a huge shame, because again, we don't fully understand what that's about. And, you know, we've seen some really high profile cases like Sushant Singh, you know, who was a high profile actor. But I guess our main conversation really is about the diaspora, you know, the people who have migrated and those people who are growing up in the West and how they struggle, because that is essentially what your book is about. Your book is about kind of really trying to understand that experience. And for many of the people that are listening and watching, they are of this same generation or similar generation. So I guess what I want to spend some time thinking about is, you know, how was suicide discussed within the themes or within the interviews? Because that's how you did that's how you collated the data, I guess. How was that discussed? What was that process like?
So I interviewed 11 people. 4 of them brought up suicide. One told her story about how her mother committed suicide, and there was one other that attempted suicide themselves, and then there was 2 others that had suicidal thoughts and ideations, but ultimately did not attempt.
So were they quite kind of forthcoming with their experiences of suicide?
Yes, because they have told their stories in the past before, so I think that it's not quite as painful or hard as them, and they've reached a high point of healing where they do feel comfortable to discuss that, I think.
And I guess just a reminder for everybody who's watching at home that this is a highly sensitive topic. If you do find that you are triggered for any reason, you know, please do take care of yourself. This might not be what you want to be listening to right now if you're in a dark place. And if you feel like you are struggling for whatever reason, please do seek the appropriate support, be it emergency services if that's what you need, but also if you need some other kind of support, that there are organizations that can be helpful. This is such a taboo topic within our community. Let's face it, nobody wants to actually talk about this. Nobody actually wants to admit that suicide occurs within our families. Suicide occurred within our histories, our ancestral histories. So for the fact that these contributors shared their stories with you is massive. And, for people who are struggling, because, this is the thing, isn't it? The suicide is such a sensitive topic, because we're talking about the loss of somebody, the kind of, they're going to the dark of all darkness, to the point where people who feel they have no other choice but to end their life, and I think that within the community there is such a lot of shame associated with that, that often the suicides or attempted suicides are often covered up. Was this something that came up within your kind of learning or reading, or even within the stories about the kind of concept of shame and stigma?
In the sense that every contributor did notice that there is shame and stigma associated with mental health, and how South Asian society views those with mental health disorders, period. I think that probably discussing suicide is kind of an extra layer to work through in terms of reducing the stigma. And I think that even though I did know that India's rate is high, it made me wonder, after having met 4 out of 11 people who had stories regarding suicide, it kind of made me question, so could suicidal tendencies perhaps be like inherited or something? And it's like, if they don't know about anyone else in their family having done so or attempted so, then that leaves them without any answers.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because I think that, I guess, what I wonder, what happens for these individuals who get to such a place where they feel there is no hope. And I guess I want to refer back to one of the stories in particular, where they discussed how they had a very, very difficult journey through their mental health, and how they got to such a dark place because they weren't taking the medication, if I'm correct in remembering the story. Do you want to just read that excerpt? That would be really powerful, if possible.
Sure. Hold on. Yeah, and I will say that regarding that story, it was that person had stated that when they first started struggling, and after their first suicide attempt, when their extended family members found out about what had happened, they accused her of attention seeking, saying that it, quote unquote, never happens in India. But then she was like, hello, what about India's high suicide rate?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, it's how we treat people who are struggling. I think there's a massive sort of a disservice we do to people that are suicidal or are kind of in such a dark place. You use the word perfectly, and I think that I've heard it so many times that people say, that they are attention seeking, they're only doing it for attention. And often we see that within people who are self-harming, for example, and more so within the younger generation, especially the teenagers, that, oh, they're only doing it because they want attention. Yes, they want your attention. They're screaming out for you to see them and for you to validate their experiences. But sadly, what tends to happen to these young people is that they are dismissed and unheard. So,
and I think that's largely due to media influences too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if you wanted to read that excerpt, if possible.
Okay. So I got to her second chapter right now, so I think that probably would be the excerpt that would summarize a lot. Okay, so after experiencing biweekly panic attacks at 14, Karandeep didn't take her anxiety medicine as directed by her doctor, but when she was hospitalized in the adolescent psychiatric unit following a suicide attempt at 15, she had no choice but to comply with taking her medicines. There were also other rules imposed on patients too. We did not have access to technological devices or phones, and we were only allowed 2 visitors at a time from 6 to 9 at night, she recalled. During this month-long stay, Karandeep was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, also called clinical depression. According to National Institute of Mental Health, MDD includes intense bouts of sadness, guilt, worthlessness, and unexplained pains without clear physical cause that last for 2 or more weeks. They could also include loss of interest in activities, decreased appetite and weight changes, chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating and sleeping, and suicidal thoughts or attempts. This was one of 7 hospital stays over 10 years that would take place. Every time she went, she received quality care, and she felt that the hospital staff members were highly dedicated to helping patients recover. We got group therapy, learned and practiced meditation, and even were allotted time to do schoolwork, she said. I ate meals with patients and enjoyed activities like relaxation and learning coping mechanisms. Her friends at school didn't understand how a young girl could end up in the hospital just from feeling sad, including her Indian friends. Since Karandeep and her father only had fun and lighthearted conversations, her mother told him she was at a friend's home. She told other family members that she was in the hospital for her low-functioning thyroid. After her discharge, she slowly told her father she was in the hospital, and he was supportive.
Yeah. And so many layers to that. I guess the bit that I want to kind of explore is the cover up, the cover story. We don't tell people that this is how you're feeling. We won't tell people that you're struggling with mental health issues and that you are hospitalized. So it still happens to this day that there's so much shame around it, that what will people say if they find out that my daughter or my son is struggling mentally and is in a mental hospital, because that's essentially how people will make sense of it. And I think that
it's like they see physical health as less shameful.
Absolutely. There's I guess it's this sort of age-old mentality around crazy, lost it, unable to cope, not resilient, not strong. It comes with all of those sorts of ideas. So,
and ironically, one of my interviewees, he had said something like, it's interesting how things like Eastern religions originate things like yoga, like meditation, like mindfulness, harmony, and spirituality that are all dedicated to improving the mind and mental well-being, yet there's no word in for mental health in the Hindi language, and you're still shunned for having a mental health disorder.
Yeah, exactly. There's just so many gaps, isn't there, in the way that mental health, the language of mental health, suicidality, and the experience of distress and kind of loss of hope, helplessness, hopelessness is experienced. There's such a big gap, and I think that's often where we see the problems, that people don't feel that they can relate to somebody who feels that distressed, that lost in terms of where they're at. But actually, we all have the capability to experience that. And one of the things that we were talking about when we had our chat before was how what were the precursors for somebody to start to think about suicide? What were the themes that we noticed? So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit like what you had observed.
So with these 4 young ladies that spoke to me, so in this chapter that I read, this person will tell you that she didn't have a reason for feeling the way she did, She didn't know why she felt the way she did. But I will say that in comparison to her, the other three, the two others were able to identify like specific incidents of trauma that led them towards their downward spiral over time. Whereas the one who said her mother committed suicide, they observed mood changes in her, but they didn't really take it as a sign that she was going to take her life.
Yeah, yeah. And that's really interesting, isn't it? That there may be a difference. There may be sort of different ways in which people will present. And I think that's the difficulty, isn't it? About knowing the signs, that maybe there are no signs. Maybe actually we just don't know. And people are very good at masking how they're feeling or masking their behaviors. I think
without even knowing it.
Absolutely. So could you talk around one of the stories around kind of what was the lead up to them wanting to take their own life?
So without giving away any spoilers, I'll say that there is an example of a lady that was in a bad marriage and was also living with in-laws that were that she didn't get along with at all, and the marriage situation, let's say, just wasn't improving over the years at all, and her life was very stagnant, and she started to blame herself. She started to question if it was her fault, but on the outside, even her family, who she was close to, had absolutely no idea for years what was going on in that marriage. And because she's good at kind of presenting a front of being okay, and despite having a family that she was well connected to and close with, she still didn't feel free to talk about her problems or state that she was struggling. So it was just kind of a slow buildup for her, and she was one that came up with a very elaborate plan on how she'll do it too. So I think that might be why she went unnoticed. So again, without sounding too spoilery, she's currently alive, but she did have the suicidal thoughts, and she was even planning how to take her life.
And you know, when we think about women or even men that are in a situation where they can't see a way out, we know that research shows this. This was shown with a research study where, this was years ago, it was a behavioral study where dogs were electrocuted, and what they found was that as a result they would show signs of helplessness, whimpering, you know, and every time, I think they paired it with a particular sound, a buzzer, and every time the buzzer went off, the dogs would start whimpering. They felt so helpless. So if you are continuously being put in a position where you are being hurt or oppressed, or you're feeling controlled, or things just are not going your way, we're going to lose hope. And the key is that, you know, that we you know, within the clinical word, we use the words hopelessness and helplessness. And when we feel like we are no longer helpless, or we have no help, or we've got no way out, and we have no hope, that is when we start to think about what's the way to leave this life. So, you know, it's a very sensitive and delicate place, and as therapists, our job is to hold that space and not to dismiss it, and to really understand why a person would start to even consider that route.
Yep, and that it's also, I'll note that these four women, before these suicidal thoughts and ideations came about, never had a day of therapy in their life. So I think that the shame in seeking out help for their struggle, or not knowing that they're suffering from a potential mental illness, also was the barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when I was looking through the literature, you know, not seeking help was a risk factor. The other risk factor was what they called acculturative stress, which is the stress of migration, the stress of trying to integrate two cultures, trying to navigate that. And, you know, within the older age category, which the research that I kind of alluded to in 2008, they found, or they suggested that, you know, older women, 65 plus, were more likely to end their lives because of maybe experiencing bereavement or maybe experiencing a long-term illness.
And in one of those stories regarding the contributor whose mom committed suicide, she had stated that she herself had a trauma that caused her anxiety, and she herself went out and got professional help, but yet her mother did not. So she thinks that that kind of shows the generational gap right there, where for mother, it kind of came back to what will other people think or say if I were to seek out help or admit to if I was struggling.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, you know, needing to put a brave face on. And I think that's so difficult, isn't it? Because I think that it's actually far braver to show our vulnerabilities and show the things that we struggle with than it is to try and lock them away and push them down. You know, I think that that's the real difficulty that we, especially with the older generation, you know, the first generation of people that moved to the, you know, the US, the UK, Canada, wherever, that they had to deal with a lot. And, you know, one of the things we also talked about was how that suicide and the link between that and you know, kind of drug abuse and alcoholism, there seems to be some sort of interconnection there, that actually, even though we may see that somebody may have died from alcohol poisoning or drug overdose or something, but in many ways that could be some form of kind of, you know, self-harm or kind of, you know, attempted suicide as well. And it's really difficult and painful to talk about for the family members who are left behind. So I guess what we should cover really are the signs and symptoms, and what we saw within the book in particular that we can reflect on. What sort of things did the contributors talk about that they sort of noticed about themselves that would potentially lead up to them thinking or contemplating?
I would say things like feeling of resentment, self-blame, helplessness, as you said. So there was one person who experienced an assault, and over the next year or so, her mood declined, her appetite declined, but she would show up every day and nobody could guess that she was struggling in any way. And then she lost a bunch of friends too, so had nobody to talk to about what was going on. And eventually it just escalated one day where she impulsively thought about taking her own life.
Yeah, and I guess that's the contrast to the other contributor who had almost kind of, it was a build-up, wasn't it, that she had planned it meticulously, as you said. So we can have two very different ways of kind of getting to that place as well. I'm just trying to think what else I needed to cover. So one other thing that I noticed about the book was that the majority of the contributors were female, as we spoke about. And, you know, I guess we wanted to explore that a little bit about the gender differences and how the women, the females, were talking about, you know, their experiences. And I guess I wonder what your thoughts are around that, around kind of the willingness for South Asian men to talk about these struggles too.
So my original intention was to have an equal amount of men and women talk. I looked up South Asian mental health organizations on the internet, and I messaged them and said, do you have any employees or any followers that would be interested in contributing to this project? I stated that they have the option of changing their name too, and only females would respond for the longest time. So then I had to kind of reconvene, like, okay, am I not reaching out to the right organizations or what? And then someone I knew said, well, maybe men just don't feel comfortable talking about mental health when it comes to them. And then, so what I did was like, okay, so should I make this book solely about females then? And then unexpectedly, one male did respond to me. And then I had one of my friends have another male respond to me. So I chose to include them anyways, even if it's just two of them, just in case like a reader has a son or something. So on that note, it's like if the women that told me their stories, nobody could sense that they were thinking of taking their own lives, what do these signs even begin to look like for men?
Yeah, and I know in the UK literature, specifically, I think in general, but in the white population, that there is a elevated risk within young men, so younger men, and also an elevated risk within men who are kind of in their middle age as well. And I think that this is the thing, we are seeing that men sadly are kind of not being given the airtime that they truly deserve. And I think that as professionals, as writers, as kind of researchers, we need to be a bit more creative in the way that we try and involve men in this research, and in just helping us to figure out kind of, how are we going to be able to support, this section of the community as well. So yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to see what that looks like for the future, definitely. But it would be good if we can start to think about that.
And it also makes me wonder if men who commit suicide or try to might be doing it for different reasons than females too.
And I think the other statistic I heard is that men are more likely to kind of accomplish suicide versus women. So that's a really interesting statistic as well. And that, again, we haven't unpicked it, and we don't know whether it is actually the same within the South Asian community. And going alongside that, I know that we haven't talked about this, but I was just thinking about this, was that alongside suicide ideation is also self-harm. And self-harm within South Asian communities is something, again, which we don't really talk about enough. And again, there's that shame and stigma associated with it. Was there any sort of conversation around self-harm within any of your contributors? Did they discuss it in any way?
No, I didn't have one that said that they went through that, other than one that suffered from PTSD and would occasionally have too much to drink after her incident.
Yeah, which would be almost classed as a self-harming behavior, because if they are using alcohol as a coping mechanism, but if they're using it to the level which is hurting their body, in many ways that could be classed as a self-harming behavior. But yeah, everybody's different, I guess.
And I feel like self-abuse is probably hard to diagnose and treat in South Asian countries themselves.
Yeah. I have no idea. I'd love to speak to somebody across the pond to see, across the way, to see if they do kind of come across that within the Indian subcontinent. I don't know, but maybe that's another discussion for another day. So if anybody who's joined that wants to ask a question, please feel free to do so. I know this is a hugely sensitive topic, and I know that it's one of these topics that is very difficult to hold space for. But I think, for me and Mrinal, it's important that we just give it some airtime, and we give it space, really, to bring it back into our consciousness. That, let's not forget that this past 18 months has been incredibly difficult for all of us, in many different ways. Many people have lost jobs, many people have kind of lost lives, lost families, you know, all sorts of stuff, and not been with and not had the same level of support that we might have been used to. So actually the risk of kind of, you know, people thinking about this is probably more prominent than we have ever even imagined right now. I'm just going to have a quick look at Jalel's message. So he's put, one of the stuff I've observed in men is the reaction to suicide. Normally it is silence, and then they provide a definite theory of how it all happened. That's really fascinating, Jalel, because, you know, I think that there's just so many layers that you have to try and unpick to work around why somebody would do this. And I guess the other bit that I would probably want to add is, like, how does religion and that kind of, you know, how do South Asian religions make sense of suicide? I know that in Hinduism in particular, I think, you know, if people die by suicide, it's deemed as very, you know, not a good death, and that they won't be able to reach moksha, and that's really, you know, again, it's what a difficult thing to even start to contemplate. And I'm assuming it's similar within other religions, that actually it is something that is very, you know, spoken out against. It's not something that, you know, is deemed as a good thing to do in any shape or form. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because how do we hold compassion? How do we hold space for that person who feels that way?
And then probably my guess is that there's the attitudes of somebody should pray more, or like read the Quran or Bhagavad Gita more or something like that, as opposed to getting like clinical help.
Yeah, it's, again, it's kind of, and you know, this is such a tricky fine line that I find I'm constantly straddling down. But I don't think there's anything wrong with engaging with religious rituals or activities. I think there's a time and place for them. But if you are at the point where you are so distressed, that's probably not going to be the most helpful thing for you at that time. And it's about kind of really picking and choosing what is going to be healing for you or helpful for you at that time.
And also, what's interesting is that one of the people that told their stories, who was raised Muslim, stated that that the Quran actually says that when you're not feeling your best mentally, you should treat it as seriously as it were a physical illness, which surprised me. And she said that depression has been noted and documented among prophets even. And even more, she said that, so this person is actually Turkish and South Asian, and she said that despite both sides of the family being Muslim, she still somehow notices such a difference between the attitudes towards mental health on both sides.
In what way was it different?
In terms of the Turkish side is more progressive than the Pakistani side. And she feels that the Pakistani side has attitudes of a depressed person should read the Quran more or something.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. And you know, it's very, very difficult to know how we could even examine that and really unpick that. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, any reflections on the book that you wanted to share around sort of suicide and suicidality.
So one thing I remember reading in that study that talked about India's high suicide rates stated that a lot of people committed suicide due to family problems. And that made me wonder if it's because in culture, family comes first in comparison to Western cultures or something.
Yeah, and I think that that's a valid sort of point that you make, that actually how we make sense of our role within the family, maybe how connected we feel or how supported we feel, or how, whether we are doing a good enough job, as in the family may impact us, you know. And I think that it's, again, everybody's different. I think there's going to be gender differences here in terms of roles and responsibilities, and you know, how people will perceive us in that space. But yeah, I do agree. I think that there is definitely more likely going to be some sort of conversation around how families support each other or how they impact each other, within the diaspora as well, definitely.
And I feel like someone made a statement in the book that the ideology that family is the most important thing comes first is a bit of a double-edged sword of pros and cons in a sense. And I feel like the findings of the World Health Organization sort of illustrate that. And what I mean by that is that putting families' needs before yours can be a respect to them, but in some other ways it could be a disrespect to you and your independence.
Yeah, and that's such a difficult balance to try and take. And we talk about boundaries and how do we set boundaries and how do we navigate these spaces. And as somebody who values their culture and should appreciate their culture in many ways, but also should be appreciative of the dominant culture, it's that real integration and being very flexible with those boundaries in many ways, that actually being rigid might not be helpful, and that we need to be creative in the way that we manage our relationships, but also to be firm in terms of what matters to us, what is it that we value, and what is it that actually, you know, we want to make sure that people don't overstep in certain scenarios. So yeah, I think the antidote to that is probably a discussion around boundaries. But again, it's not something that we are taught, it's something that we have to learn as a skill. And sadly, when we haven't been brought up in families where boundaries are obvious, you know, for children growing up in a boundaryless environment in many ways, it's quite difficult. And then to suddenly start to apply these boundaries feels quite, yeah, tricky to manage for the other person, but more so for us to try and put in place.
And the other common theme I noticed was that a lot of people who told their stories were ashamed to seek help because they didn't know anyone else in their community that did so. And then furthermore, the ones that saw like white American therapists, they faced kind of that education gap in terms of having to spend a lot of time teaching the therapist about their culture and their cultural norms, and that kind of some people just not want to seek therapy. And whereas the ones that did seek a therapist of South Asian descent or just from the same religion as them, they could be a lot more upfront and honest and tell it how it is with that person, and they could uncover insights with that therapist that they did not have before regarding being able to understand their elders' viewpoints a little bit better in order to solve kind of like the rifts and family conflicts that they had.
Absolutely, yeah. It's exactly that, isn't it? And again, it's really hard because for somebody, a white therapist is exactly what they need. You know, somebody who is culturally aware is probably ideal, but not every white therapist is going to be like that, and not every South Asian therapist is going to have the same level or understanding of somebody who is of South Asian descent. So there is a bit of a, you know, a fine line there as well. So I'm thinking, was there anything else we needed to cover for today?
I think that's about it on mine.
We've covered quite a lot, haven't we, really? I mean, this discussion isn't about, you know, what to do or how to tell or, you know, anything like that. This is really just an observation that we both, as a clinician, but also as a researcher, we felt that this conversation needs to happen. And what Mrinal's book has beautifully done is illustrated the complexity around somebody's mental health issues, that people struggle because of stuff, because of stuff that's happened to them or happened to their families. So, you know, suicide doesn't happen in isolation. It happens because of various things that have happened, and it's the way that they then think about the world and themselves and all of that. So that it's a very complex process. And I think that, you know, the Saya Unveiled book, it does a brilliant job at illustrating how somebody can get from one place to another, and how a lot of these people who you would probably conversating with on a daily basis are going through stuff that you wouldn't even know. And that we as a community are very good at masking what is going on. So for those people who feel like themselves, they are struggling, that they're the only one, believe me, there is more of us out there than you would assume. We are all battling our own various difficulties in our own way. We just are very good at hiding it and masking it and not talking about it. And this is where it needs to change. We need to start to be having these frank, open, honest conversations that this does happen in our society, in our communities. And, you know, there is sadly a lot of shame, a lot of stigma, but actually what we need to be sharing with our communities is that there is no shame, that actually this is sadly because we are failing our families, our brothers, our sisters, our uncles, our aunts. We need to be doing more. We need to be providing spaces for them that we can be okay with not being okay. You know, it's a cliched saying, but we don't have to fix them. We have to listen, and we have to yeah, really, really, really listen to them and pay attention to them. That's essentially all it takes, is listening with our ears and not trying to fix people.
And when I did write this book, someone once asked me, "What's your goal?" And one of my main goals is to illustrate, to help other South Asians out there not feel so alone, and hopefully when it comes to like the elder generation of the first generation ones, to kind of expand their knowledge regarding mental health outside of what the media shows them it is, in order to become more educated and accepting around it. And then also to show them that I think every reader that reads the book, I want them to take away that your concerns should not be swept under the rug regarding mental health, no matter who you are, where you come from, what you were taught, no matter how much worse you think somebody else has it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that our struggles are real, and that, oh, everybody else deals with this stuff and they're fine. No, they're not fine. We are all struggling in some shape or form, and we are sadly pushing it down, dealing with it by drinking too much or eating too much or not eating enough, or, you know, it comes out in some way. And for many of us, which is sad, is that, you know, we end up being very, very poorly. We may have, you know, chronic heart disease, we may have, you know, high blood pressure, and this is the way it presents within our bodies as well. So we have to start to, absolutely, absolutely.
That's something the DSM-5 doesn't necessarily explore much, and people don't see it when it happens, that their physical health could be related to their mental health.
Yeah. You know, we could, again, this is a whole new other discussion that can clearly happen, but yes, of course, because the research shows that there are links, there are direct links to, you know, stress, acute stress, chronic stress, having a direct impact on the body, on the gut health, you know, on the system itself. So our traditional therapies and healing practices, that's why they're holistic. That's why you use the breath, and that's why you have good nutrition, and that's why you have good sleep, and that's why you stretch and move and do all the right things. So we have to start to pay attention and take responsibility, not only for others, but also for ourselves. And that to acknowledge that there are therapists, there are, you know, professionals, there are people out there that are willing to support you, and you have a place where you will be heard and validated and cared for. because that's what we do. And you know that as a community and as a generation, we are becoming more and more tolerant and more aware of the fact that people struggle. We all struggle, and that's it.
Looks like someone asked a question.
Okay, let me see if I can find it. Sorry. Oh, I missed all this. Wonderful. Yeah. Okay. How to let go of trauma after abuse parent die. How to find closure without feeling suicide. Such a difficult question, Sneha. I would say that, you know, the trauma has to be worked on. And it's very difficult to kind of be very clear on what you're asking. But I would seek support. Simple as that. It's got to be that you can't do this by yourself. It's too much for many people to hold by themselves. So my sort of recommendation is that if you are feeling like you are struggling to contain and manage this by yourself, please seek help. It's simple as that. Okay, I'm just having a quick look to see if anybody else has messaged any. So we've kind of discussed where people can find the book, and it's on Amazon in the UK. It's Amazon on the US as well. Is that correct?
Yes. So so the link to the American website is in my bio on my page, but yes, it is available on the UK website as well.
Yeah, I did a search the other day, and it was like, yeah, it's there, which is wonderful. I'm just gonna have a look at this comment here. As brown women, we are held to higher standards and standards which can often limit us. How can we cope with that? And it's interesting, isn't it? Because like you said, there was this sort of gender imbalance within the contributors of your book. Did any of the contributors talk about the standards that women are held to?
They would discuss things such as, one common pattern I found was that parents would allow their sons to do more stuff than their daughters, such as date or stay out late at night and stuff like that. So that's one thing. They felt as though their male counterparts weren't questioned as much by their elders on the stuff that they did. They didn't experience as many notions of things like sexism. Women, some others reported that women face more blame for the trauma that they experience for things such as assault. Another story, the one with the toxic marriage, she was expected to hold down the whole household while also working and taking care of 2 babies.
Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? And I guess it ties into, you know, the comment that we had, is that there is such high standards placed on women, such, you know, such pressures being placed on women. And, you know, how do we cope with that? Well, boundaries is one way that we can do that, but ultimately it's really very difficult to navigate a system like the contributor, like you said, that she felt so stuck. You know, she felt so stuck. She couldn't function. She felt like the pressure was too much. And essentially, what happens when the pressure gets too much is that we crumble under the pressure. And that's simple as that. We can only cope with so much, you know, so many demands.
And culturally speaking, if someone of South Asian descent I can see them, like if they were to ask like a white American friend, I'm going through a toxic marriage and abusive like in-laws or something, move out, get a divorce. I can't.
Yeah,
it's not that simple or admired in our culture.
Absolutely. It's very black and white, isn't it? And very much heavily relying on the individual to have that level of autonomy, which many women actually are not. We're not taught that we can have autonomy. We don't have autonomy over our own bodies, you know. So it's very, very tricky to then just suddenly say to somebody, "Oh, right, so just leave." it's not that simple. And I think that, you know, it's really down to empowering the person who is in that situation to help them make their own decision that is going to meet their needs in some way. There's no sort of straightforward answer to how we can navigate situations or contexts that essentially are out of our control.
Yeah, so it's not impossible for someone to move out of their parents' house or get a divorce, but it may not be as easy as it is for a person who was not raised under the family first mindset, or you take care of your parents because they took care of you mindset. And that's where something like working with a clinician who comes from the same culture, the same religion as you could kind of be more helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the trick is to help hold that tension with them and not do the rescuing and telling them what to do. And that's the process. Essentially, what we want is for people to develop that inner strength and that inner wisdom for themselves. I'm just having a look at this comment. Experiences and struggles we have can trap us and leave us feeling scared to be judged, not to know who to trust, and always advised to compromise. It's definitely a complex, more women, yes, absolutely, it is about that. So yeah, thank you so much for your comments. Okay, we have literally a few minutes left before we need to close up. So I guess what I would firstly just like to say is thank Mrinal for joining us and sharing her wonderful book with us. And tell us where people can find you if they kind of want to connect with you in some way.
I am on Instagram and LinkedIn, and you should see you'll see my handle in her link where she posted about this video.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, well, everybody, I hope you found this helpful in some shape or form. And yeah, I will see you on the next live. I haven't planned one yet, but I'm sure I'll do one soon. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a lovely evening or whatever the rest of the day it is for you. And yeah, take care. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.